The Holy Gospel according to John, the 5th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool, called in Hebrew Bethzatha, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Well, what a week, huh? To top off all the deaths that we faced as a congregation together, we had all of this weather. Storms and hail and tornadoes and flooding. And I think you were there for it. I've seen reports around that there have been more than 170 weather events strike the Midwest area in 1 week. And I got that number a couple days ago, so it's probably grown by now. But in all of that, we've seen the destruction of property, the disruption of livelihoods, and the loss of life. Add all of that to the list of all the other things in this world that have been troubling us in these days, and we just keep heaping the troubles and the worries of this world on our shoulders, on our minds, and in our hearts. So where do we turn? Well, let me pause here and just remind us that if there is something you want to help with the weather-related disasters, if you feel called to reach out with financial resources, one way is doing so through Lutheran Disaster Response. Anytime you make a donation through Lutheran Disaster Response that's earmarked for a specific disaster, all of your donation goes towards that. Now, I don't mean to insert this commercial in the middle of a sermon because I remember last week talking about how annoying advertising is in the middle of everything, and here I am doing it. But I think it's good for us to be reminded of what our church does. Lutheran Disaster Response is one of the outreach ministries of the ELCA, just like World Hunger, who we'll support next week, or Young Adults in Global Mission, who we had the guest here many months ago. And I know many of us have mixed feelings about the larger denomination we are part of, but this is one example of what the church does. Of the mission support that we send to the Synod, half of it stays local to support local work, but the other half goes to the larger church. And with that money, the ELCA oversees these kinds of ministries, like Lutheran Disaster Response. And that's why every dollar given goes to that disaster, because our church makes sure that that framework is in place. Okay, so I apologize for the commercial, but in a way I kind of don't apologize, because we need to know how we are church together and what we as a church, as a whole church, do. Because it seems like our faith compels us to do something, doesn't it? I mean, with all of the things going on around us, we want to do something, whether recently or just in general. But we usually don't know what to do. So we, end up posting something on Facebook and hoping that that's going to compel someone else to do the thing that we should do. Or this doing attitude gets us into thinking how our faith and our salvation is ultimately in our hands, and we have to do something to secure it. We have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. That's something we have to do. We We have to keep our brokenness inside of us and hidden away so that no one is ever the more aware. And we have to do that on our own. And there are some times where the things we do are absolutely necessary. Reaching out when disaster strikes, giving away some of our resources to people and places in need, caring for those who are vulnerable, doing the things that Christ teaches and compels us to do. But as we know, the trouble comes when we start doing the things that are in God's hands. So in today's gospel story, we heard about this pool called Bethsaida, which literally means house of mercy or house of flowing water. And in those days, it was believed that an angel of the Lord would go down to the waters of this pool and stir them up. And the first person that would get into those waters, just after that water has been stirred up, would have been healed and made well. I mean, that was totally opposite of that whole last shall be first and first shall be last. I mean, this was an example of the first one's the winner, the last one's a rotten egg. But here laid this man who had been ill for 38 years, right beside the healing waters. And every time the waters were stirred up, every time he had this opportunity for healing, there was no one who was able or willing to assist him to get down into the water. Or if he was able to make his way to the side of the water on his own power, someone else would jump in and step right in front of him. And this happened for 38 years. And could you imagine that? Someone who is weak and vulnerable getting overlooked and overpowered over and over again. Hard to imagine these days, right? But this is when Jesus arrives. And instead of this man having to go down into the water of the pool to be healed, this man is now healed with the power of Jesus' words. Stand up, take your mat, and walk, says Jesus. And he does. There are a lot of things that we can do to bring about healing and wholeness and reconciliation in this world. But it's always in the name and in the power of God that healing and wholeness can happen. So I know it was not lost on many of us that the recent string of tornadoes, especially the one that landed just north of Joplin a couple weeks ago, or just a couple days ago, and claimed 3 lives, happened 8 years to the day from the historic tornado that landed in Joplin. And maybe you've heard this story, but all of this with the anniversary made me think of this really powerful thing that Kim's church did after that Joplin tornado struck 8 years ago. And she said I was allowed to tell the story, so I can tell it. And maybe you've heard this, but shortly after that tornado struck, when she was at Christ and Trinity in Sedalia, one of her high school youth group members called her, and he said, "We need to go down there. We need to do something." So within a few days, one of the parents of the high schoolers got the group together. They coordinated with a relief agency that was down there, and they set up a time where they could all go down there and spend some time volunteering, sorting, and just helping out with some of the relief efforts. Then when they finished with that, they decided to drive around a little bit to see what they could see. And they came across the site of Peace Lutheran Church, the ELCA church that was down in Joplin that got completely leveled by the tornado. And when they got there, they stopped. And they got out of their cars and they walked around the site for a little while. And in the midst of all of the debris, the collapsed building, the pews, the hymnals that were strewed everywhere, they noticed little pieces of broken glass. Do you remember this story? Have you heard this? And they quickly realized that these pieces of glass were from their stained glass windows. And not knowing what might come of it, they started collecting a bunch of those broken pieces. Some might call that theft, but it turns out well. But over the next few months, something was stirring in this group. Those broken pieces of glass that they had held on to They were telling them to do something. And in the end, with the help of an artist and a craftsman, they created this giant cross. And they took all those pieces of broken glass and they laid them on top of the cross, and they had a light behind it so the light would shine through these broken pieces. All of this without the church knowing what they had done. So one Sunday morning, this same youth group drove down to Joplin. They joined Peace Lutheran Church for their Sunday morning service in their temporary space. And at the end of the service, they came up front, they told them what they had done, and they revealed this cross to them. Healing and wholeness that was created from these broken fragments of their past. That cross now hangs above their altar, right in the middle of their chancel in their brand new worship space, as a testament to what God can make whole in this world and what we as the body of Christ can do together. How often do we experience God's healing in those times when we feel broken or hurt? You know, in the midst of facing the death of a loved one, are there moments where we can find hope in knowing they no longer suffer? Or finding joy in some lost treasure as we go through their belongings? Or isn't it in the moments where we are at our lowest that we can more fully and clearly experience God's love? It's different for everyone. But when we look back in history, we see that this is exactly what God did through Jesus on the cross. God took the brokenness of our humanity and made us whole through the power of Jesus' resurrection. All of these stories that we can tell that are a part of us tell us that nothing, whether it be the laws of the Sabbath, as we heard in the gospel, or the weight of sin, or the power of death, nothing can stop God's redemptive power in this world that continues to make things whole. This weekend especially, it comes to mind for us the freedom and the healing and the wholeness that we have in this country, thanks to all of those military personnel who made the ultimate sacrifice by laying down their life for the sake of the rest of us. Again, when we hear these words of Christ, when we experience this power of God in the resurrection and in all that God does in this world, we too are given the ability to rise up and walk. We are given the ability to share healing and life with those who are around us. And we are given the ability to experience for ourselves the wholeness of this life, thanks to Jesus' resurrection. Thanks be to God. Amen.